Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar series presented by Observer. My name is Mary Von Owie, and I'm Observer's editorial director. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from Asbury Park, New Jersey. In an effort to acknowledge Indigenous tribes, I'd like to point out that I'm speaking to you from the Lenape territory. I'd also like to describe the current imagery for those with visual impairment. I am a white woman wearing gold eyeglasses and a black sweater and standing behind a gray wall. I'll let each of our panelists describe the room here in a minute. First, some background on today's event. Every year, Observer sets out to take stock of what is happening in the art industry, releasing the Arts Power 50, which is currently on our website, and is a list of leaders who we believe are taking this sector to new heights, creating new strategies to make the art world more viable, more accessible, and more equitable. For our third edition, we decided to organize some conversations with these leaders to discuss the urgent issues that are facing artists and art workers alike. Today, we are discussing what equity looks like in the art world and speaking to three individuals whose pioneering work shows how the industry can foster a truly inclusive approach to the creation, exhibition, and sale of art. Kibum Kim is co-director of the gallery Commonwealth and Council, who was joined on this list with his business partner, Young Chung. Now celebrating 10 years in business, the gallery has from the start championed the artistic practices of women, queer, people of color, and ally artists to do what they do, and they quote as build counter histories that reflect our individual and collective realities. Kibum, would you also like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, thank you for joining. My name is Kibum Kim. My pronouns are he, him. I am in Los Angeles on Tangba land, and I'm an East Asian male with short, currently dusty rose, I hope, hair, sitting in a room with a bright pink background.
Thank you, thank you. We're also joined by Kemi Ilesanmi, Executive Director of the Laundromat Project, an arts nonprofit that advances artists and neighbors as change agents in their own communities, supporting arts projects across New York City, and this year, working towards opening its first permanent headquarters, which will be in Bed-Stuy. Kemi, if you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you so much for this invitation. I'm Kemi Ilesanmi, Executive Director of the Laundromat Project, and I'm joining you from Brooklyn, New York, Flatbush, which is Lenape land. And my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a Black woman with dreadlocks. White, big white glasses, white frame glasses. I'm wearing a red shirt and my favorite pin of a Black woman with an afro. Her hair is felt, it's very nice. And behind me are a number of my favorite books.
Thank you, thank you. And joining them is Nicola Vassell. Nicola is the founder of Concept NV, a curatorial agency that provides art advisory services, collection management, and all aspects of exhibition planning from conceptualization through presentation. She works closely with the Dean Collection, founded by Swizz Beatz and Alicia Keys. And with them, she was instrumental in creating the limited series Art Fair No Commission, which delivered 100% of the profits back into the hands of artists. So Nicola, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you to the Observer for hosting this conversation today. I am an art dealer, advisor, curator, and founder of Concept NV. I am she, her, a brown-skinned, black-haired, cis female of Jamaican origin, sitting in front of a stack of books and coming to you live from what was formerly Lenape land. Indeed, it is a brave new world, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna get started, and I want to let people know who are who are in the room here that you can submit your questions via Q&A. There's an option on your screen. We may not get to every question, but we will answer a few along the way and save some time at the end as well. So let's get started. This year, the art world had to confront its history of involvement in racial injustice and the ways in which institutions still benefit from it. We talked about this earlier, and I think about examples like the Whitney Museum this year that the Whitney received a lot of criticism for acquiring work from Black artists significantly under market value. But many of these instances, there's public outcry, there's criticism, but oftentimes there's little accountability. So this panel is called A Reckoning. And I want to kick things off right away and get straight to the point and ask this team, do you feel like a substantial reckoning took place in the industry this year? And who'd ever like to go first can jump in.
Well, I'll say that the reckoning is real and will endure, but with an eye towards better outcomes, because activists have refused to take their feet off the gas. There's been a purge on many levels in the ranks and in the highest offices of power, where thinking might have been fossilized and needed a renewal. But the bloodlet was not gentle, it was swift. And I mean, one could question style, but the results are making way for the most astonishing conversations I've ever seen. The uncomfortable job here is to reimagine history, with more expansive peripheries. So the unanimous push to do so, fueled by the will of the people, may go down as one of the greatest human endeavors ever.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think you touch upon a good point, though, that this is historical, that much of this is systemic, and equity begins early on. So I actually want to ask Kemi this question because of the work that you do with the Laundromat project. What's missing from the art education system in the US that you would like to see change this year?
I would say, and the Laundromat Project works with artists directly, commissioning artists, and then we also work in community, and very much, certainly arts education is a big part of that. And I would say one of the biggest things missing in our field, and these are the kinds of reckonings going on, is a sense of accountability, a sense of reciprocity, and a centering of the people who actually are engaged in this work and the people who actually make up this country and should make up the majority of the people who we're engaging and feeling relevant to. So one of the things that I'm constantly wrestling with and oftentimes frustrated with some of our bigger institutions is this sense of relevance. What does it actually mean to be relevant? And to me, that's part of the reckoning. It is not just to have objects for the sake of having objects. It really is because those objects are part of a larger conversation. Many of us are dealing and working with living artists, living people, living audiences. Are we relevant? Are we engaged in conversations that they care about and want to be part of? And that happens in arts education, it happens in our public programs, it happens in the work we put on our walls, the works we bring into our collections, every single part of the work we do, and who our staff is and who our board is. All of those should be engaged in a conversation of relevance.
Absolutely. And I think that, when we talk about relevance, so much relies on conversation and creating better communication between artists and between artists and communities, between artists and investors, artists and educators. Each of you have created spaces for that kind of communication. I know Kibum does weekly Zooms. I know that Kemi, you have brought artists into the community and fostered that conversation. Nicola, you have done excellent work by putting artists in front of collectors and buyers without the middleman. This year was so incredibly disruptive to the industry. Can you each share some of the ways that the events in 2020 have affected artists' accessibility to the resources they might need and to the conversations that they need to be a part of. And I'd like to start with you, Kibum, if you don't mind.
Sure. And quickly, I actually like to address your first question for a second. So, I mean, I think this year has been, for me, I think it's probably the most difficult year in my life that I can remember, but also one that gives me a lot of hope because of these conversations we're having. I have never been part of a panel that looks like this. So that, for one, is a true honor and a kind of beautiful change, I hope, in our industry, which still is particularly elitist in certain ways. And I just want to say is like, one thing that I listened to that has just really anchored me in my thinking around this was when Ta-Nehisi Coates did a podcast conversation with Ezra Klein. And he speaks about 2020, this moment, this the reckoning about racial inequity as being perhaps more powerful than what we saw in the 60s, because we are seeing those who hold the privilege and power. And maybe it was something that was made possible by the fact that, through COVID lockdown, like everyone just felt their own bodies being endangered. We felt the precarious, we felt the experiences of, not having access, as your next question is, to certain things that we take for granted. And I think that prepped everyone to be able to, feel more empathy with the plights of those who are oppressed on, in vectors of race, gender, sexuality, class. So I'm very hopeful about 2020. At Commonwealth and Council, what we do is, it really stems from our small community of artists. We have about 30 artists in our program now, and the gallery formed as an artist-run space. We are celebrating our 10 years this month. And it started out in an apartment and just became a commercial gallery a few years ago. But we still try to very much root ourselves in what the artists want and need. And so that was like the first thing when COVID hit, was to try to connect with everyone and see what their situation is. Thankfully, no one was in like terribly dire like financial situation or anything like that. A lot of them have teaching jobs, but they actually came up with the idea that they want to connect with other artists and to be able to connect with the larger art world and beyond. So something that we did this summer is to run a summer school where the artists all came up with classes, and we did it on Zoom. It was important that it was accessible to everyone. It felt important to make it free. And yeah, we're continuing to explore different kinds of ways, but it really does come from the artists and what they are looking for. Obviously none of us would be here without artists.
Very true. Very true. I want to pivot for a second because we are getting some questions in. And our first question that arrived is for each of you. Let's say, Kemi, if you'd like to start with this, but we have a question from Claude Grunitsky from True Africa. I want to ask about what you are personally doing to increase Black ownership in the contemporary art segment of the creative industries. And Kemi, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to. I'm guessing Nicola might actually have a better, this is kind of her area, and then I can swing in. Does that make sense?
We'll pivot. Nicola, take it away.
Sure. Well, at this juncture, it feels like the sum total of all efforts that have been exacted and set upon over the last few years. I personally have always been interested in Black wealth generation and ownership. It is fundamental to all other variables in terms of mobility and viability. So, this is when we start thinking about property, higher education, influence. All these things are very, very important. Bar none, I think that is where the buck stops. So looking at the force of Black economics in the art world right now, vis-a-vis artists and gallerists and institutions, I am interested in owning my own gallery, and that is a high and mighty pursuit. And in the new year, in early 2021, that will be an absolute manifestation. So at this point, it's about the redistribution of this power and wealth, and particularly because it's self-generated, I don't see why we shouldn't all have a hand and participate and get back as much as we give back.
Absolutely. Do you want to chime in?
Yes, absolutely. So very much agree that it is part of what I think is so interesting about this moment is there are many different parallel conversations happening, as there should be. There is no one conversation. And one of the things that I think is really important and that I've personally been involved in is conversations between Black-owned spaces and Black-led galleries and arts community centers, et cetera, in New York City and nationally. Really conversations that are about what can we do, what do we need, and how do we define for ourselves. Some of the big words that I think about are issues of self-definition and self-determination. And to your point, even Kibum, of what Ta-Nehisi was saying, not only about vulnerability, but just how has the world shifted since 1960? The 1960s in general, we have wealth in a different way. We have a different understanding of ourselves, and we are able to affirm ourselves as people of color. We are we have defined and created spaces for ourselves, going back to the late 60s and 70s, and the Studio Museum and the El Museos. And we've also defined spaces much more recently, and we want to say who they are, what they are, and who gets to benefit. And those conversations are equally happening. And it's really about shifting power and actually harnessing power for ourselves to have those conversations, to decide how we want to move forward, how we want to be seen. So what I thought was so fascinating and interesting about all the letters, et cetera, this over the summer was both that oftentimes young people were saying, if you want us to be part of this industry, here's what needs to change. And then there have also been a lot of self-directed initiatives coming from organizations of color, Black people, Asian folk, Latinx folks, Native folks, and all saying, we're going to found the Black Seed, which is all about supporting Black theaters, the Solidarity Fund, which Alternate Roots is doing to support BIPOC artists in the South. And there's so many of these little conversations happening where people are actually figuring out for themselves. The Black School has raised $200,000 through GoFundMe to build their own freestanding Black art school in New Orleans. And they didn't go through any institution. They said, this is something we have, there's a vision we have, and we're going to push it forward. And that's, I think, such an interesting and exciting part of this moment.
Yes, and Kemi, thank you. I have so many follow-up questions, but before we get there, I do want to pivot to Kibum, because as a gallerist, I'm curious to hear your answer from this question as well on what we can be doing to increase Black ownership in the contemporary art segment.
Yeah, and with that, I think that's what this sort of reckoning and self-examination that we're all hopefully engaging with now is very important. You know, like even before this, there's been a lot of this kind of market and critical, very deservedly so, attention for Black artists. But it's also critical the kinds of jobs that Nicola does and Kemi does. And, you know, there's some great Black-owned gallery spaces now. KJ Freeman runs Housing Gallery in New York. I actually teach in an art market program. I have a young student, Storm Asher, who runs a great program called Superposition Gallery that I'm super proud of. And it's important to support these kinds of projects and spaces and make sure that all of the people working as like middle people or in the background are being given the opportunities as well. And you know, something that really struck me when I listened to a talk about a bunch of POC writers panel that I listened to a few months ago, they were all saying like how refreshing it was when they worked with other POC editors, because they didn't have to explain, you know, oh, what do you mean by this? You know, oh, I didn't understand this part, you know, like what we assume as the norm and how they very much track different kinds of implicit, we're talking a lot about systemic inequality and inequity right now. What does that mean? These are these like ingrained, invisible perhaps things. I'm in a group chat with a bunch of young dealers, and we've been talking, and the number of times, if we're standing in an art fair booth and we might have, we're the owners, but we might have junior staff who are white. Who do you think people go to talk to? Or female owners with male employees? These are the things that I think like perhaps don't get acknowledged because it's not explicit, but they are all manifestations of the power structures that, alienated and marginalized. And I think now is a great moment to really take a deep look at that. And it is very, very important to support Black-owned businesses.
Absolutely. And I want to go back to what Kemi mentioned too about redefining these words that have been part of the systemic problem, especially the term power. When we talk about visibility, that contributes to power. When we talk about influence, one thing that Observer tried to do with this year's power list is to reshape how we define power, how power is expressed in 2020. We could have done a power list like other people where we just list the 50 richest people in the industry, but that's not power right now. That's not influence. Those aren't the change makers necessarily. So I'd like to actually ask each of you, and Kemi, if you don't mind going first, because you did bring up this excellent point, is how can we define power for the artist? Is that sovereignty over their work? Is that more visibility? How would you personally define power in this industry?
Yes. And I think very much of artists, and I also think of arts organizations, right? And building an institution, and very, very deliberately and intentionally building a BIPOC and Black-led specifically institution. And I think very much a power to this point, the ability to say who we are is so much a part of that power. The ability to say who gets to participate in our work and be part of our community, that to me is very much power. And I'm looking at how artists are beginning to define for themselves, who am I sure I want this person to own this work? Is that the only just because they have enough money to pay for it, is that the only way I'm going to make this decision? What community am I going to work in? We work with artists who don't sell a lot of objects. They really are connected to community, and they're looking for places that can support that work. And that's so much what I'm here to do, is like, yes, please do this work that's process oriented and doesn't lead to an object, but it's so important to you and to the community of folks that you're engaged with. And we work with people inside a community. We don't parachute in. We support projects where people are a part of the community with which they work, be that geography or affinity. Mm-hmm. And that power to do that in the ways that people have said how instrumental that has been in their practice, to be able to define and pick and be with the audience and be in an audience that they're in the rest of their lives, but be acknowledged and paid to do that work within that community, is mind-blowing for them and incredible for us to be able to kind of continue to support that. So I think power is about being able to determine and move around the pieces of this work, the money, the people, the influence, the visibility. And to Kibum's point, there is something so powerful about being inside a conversation, particularly for folks of color, where too often we are the exception in the room and not the rule.
Yeah, indeed. I'd like to add to that this idea of how power is distributed among peers and from those who have actual and legitimate power, and how that might engender power as it flows continually through ranks. And, so I think a lot of, when I started in the business 16 years ago, and there weren't very many people like me in the dealer ranks. And now there's so many, and we have the most generous conversations about how we make moves, how we strategize, how we work with artists. And most of all, it's so nourishing because everyone understands what's at stake here. So we're also coupling it with the moment in which society at large is calling for this redistribution and this new this responsibility around aspects of power. So, and even women of color, men of color, all of it, the mega galleries, everyone is thinking very, very, very specifically about this. And I think people are thinking generously about it. So I'm very optimistic. But yes, power absolutely has a different shape these days.
Mm-hmm. Kibum, can you weigh in on this?
Yeah, so actually, we're very flattered, but
Oh,
in many ways, like we're like why, like, do we have power? It's like, it's certainly not economic. Maybe we have some sort of cultural power or social capital. And yeah, so I actually gave some thought to what power means. Power means the ability to sway people, to compel, to have influence, to seduce, which is part of, I think, the dealer's jobs in many ways. And for me, at this moment, like, the power to convince someone to buy something is not so exciting anymore. And I think we're already beyond this conversation about representation and inclusion. We have to go to the next step of talking about, like, okay, so this artist is getting a lot of attention and they made a beautiful piece that hangs on a wall. So you want it, you want to buy it, let's talk about how you're going to talk about it. Let's talk about, like, what it means to you. Let's talk about how you're going to represent that work and how you're going to honor and grow that relationship between you and that artwork, and by extension, your relationship with the artist and continuing support for the artist. That's the kind of power that I'm interested in developing and growing. And even with a lot of our artists in our gallery program is, we are at that stage where many of them are beginning to get a lot of market demand, but it's not so exciting to sell, like, a beautiful painting. It's much more exciting to sell that, like, very difficult piece, a box of dirt that is a receptacle to age, like, ancient artifacts. It's like a machine that our artists made. And and for someone who is used to these kinds of, like, consumerist transactions, to really understand and appreciate that, and to be proud to own that, and to be able to look at it, and for it to foster these kinds of new ways of thinking, like, that's very exciting. And also, I just want to, like, quickly also just to pin, I think right now is a very interesting and exciting time where we can think about or rethink the whole notion of property and ownership. And that kind of belief that if you buy something, if you paid for it, then that is yours and you can do whatever you want with it. Can we expand upon that? There's already kind of precedence for this in thinking about the art world. I think the whole kind of efforts to institute resale rights for artworks that are resold are very much come out of this way of thinking. And I think it's no surprise that there have been multiple new efforts to bring up this conversation again about resale royalties. There's, like, a new proposed bill. There are also private contracts that are being proffered. So that is exciting, and I think that will continue, and I hope we will all participate in this, and again, just, like, question the status quo.
Yeah, I want to talk a little more about that, actually, because you bring up a really important point about power, that in many instances this is not economic power for artists and disenfranchised communities in the industry. So it's not necessarily economic power. And thinking about that, I'd really like to talk about the market for a second. you gave a great quote, Kibum, to our reporter, Helen Holmes, in our Power List. And I have it written up here because you said, thinking about the long term, most artists don't have retirement plans. And when we think about how reselling and the way in which the artist's ownership of these pieces deteriorates, can you talk a little more about how, how can the market change to give artists a little more power, a little more sovereignty over their work?
Yeah, so something that we've been working on, and it's still sort of being ironed out at the moment, but two kind of initiatives that we have at Commonwealth and Council. Number one is a trust of artworks. So the artists who are participating are all going to contribute artworks that kind of creates a collection. And we will hold on to it for a number of years until some of them accrue kind of a lot of market value. And then when they get resold, all of the proceeds will be split evenly among the artists. And so that came out of a conversation, in these weekly Zooms that we held from the artists. We all know that out of like the program of almost 30 artists, is like it's not all of them who are getting whose careers are on the same kind of trajectory or going at the same speed, but they, EJ Hill might be getting a lot of attention, but they just as much appreciate and love Julie Tolentino making incredibly complex, kind of sometimes difficult performance work. And this is one way in which we're exploring, like, how can we support each other, and also to eschew this kind of star system that we have in the art world, where a few people are anointed for success, and it's a bit of a winner-take-all capitalist model, and that's kind of our small way to protect ourselves and each other from that. And our hope with it is that, like, it's something that we would be happy to share all of the details, and if anyone wants to take it on, and other kind of collectives of artists or galleries want to take it on and implement it, they could do so. And another initiative we have is what we're right now calling the Commonwealth and Council Fund. So having conversations with collectors and museums and saying is like, you customarily get a 10% discount, but we're trying to gain a bit more agency so that the artists are able to support each other. And for something as ordinary as health insurance for those who don't have it, to more ambitious projects that need funding, but instead of always having to like reach out to our collectors and patrons, for us to have a bit more agency in how we choose to allocate funds. And also, like, we would like to sort of put an asterisk around this whole notion and practice and conversation of how discounts are negotiated and doled out. It's usually the people who hold the most amount of privilege and power and money that get the biggest discounts. Why is that? And like, how is that money flowing? And already we've gotten quite a lot of great supporters who have signed on, and that's been encouraging. And it does feel like the reckoning that we're going through has made it possible to have these kinds of conversations that really go against the traditional ways of how the art market works.
Thank you so much. That was a really insightful. And I also want to ask Nicola a similar question, because you are also in this market, but from a different part of the art ecosystem. I love what you're doing with art advisory and outreach, and reflecting on what you did with no commissions previously. You created direct sales between the artist and the buyer, which would give the artist more self-determination over their work, but it cuts out the middleman. And I'm curious, did you encounter a lot of grumpy people by cutting out the middleman in those sales?
Well, the middleman is very important in the art world, as we know, and will forever be. When we started No Commission, it really was a goodwill project. It was, we had no idea the future would look as it does now. But we understood that artists in many cases were getting left behind economically. And so, many of them had no idea how to administer their practices, much as how to negotiate, transactionality, how to manage production, distance transport, all this stuff. So, NC by virtue of its structure was really able to highlight those things and give artists a more practical taste of those circumstances. Of course, a lot of galleries were not thrilled, but at the same time, the Dean Collection began to expand its acquisition position. So a lot of the artists who we know now as full-fledged art heroes were coming into recognition at that time, and in some cases have been working for many years. It was like a very natural progression, and we wanted the galleries to understand that this was really about support and service at all levels. So once that happened, they really relaxed and understood that these were strategies meant to nourish and not predation or extraction, but really beneficial for the entire ecosystem. So I suppose it was double weights at work, a balance enforced and arrived at that made everyone happy, not least of all the artists.
Right. I want to also pivot to another question from someone participating. They asked this question anonymously. Can you talk a little about how to build a board of directors responsibly? Like Kemi mentioned, keeping the organization relevant and reflective of the community served, while also engaging with individuals that are well connected, that have the resources to support at a high level. In general, how can art boards be more responsibly put together from the top down? How are you thinking about changing the system? And this person also says, thank you for the conversation. I appreciate you each. Kemi, do you mind taking this away? Because this person mentioned what you discussed about, creating a thoughtful organization.
Absolutely, absolutely. Interestingly enough, the call I had shortly before this webinar was an information session for a number of folks who had responded, amazing people who had responded to our open call saying that we were looking for board members. And I was inspired by a friend who runs the Center for Urban Pedagogy, which had done the same quite successfully a year or two ago. And we literally used LinkedIn and Facebook and our email list, et cetera, and said, we're looking for new board members, which we're always looking for new board members because that's, you're always keeping your pipeline, et cetera. But by saying it out loud and saying this is what we're looking for and really striving for a sense of transparency, we had a number of people apply and fill out interest forms who we never even knew were interested and who are incredible and have such incredible things they want to bring to the organization. And even if they don't end up on the board, they have other ways that they might engage. And they helped us fundraise during our crowdfunding, peer-to-peer fundraiser that just ended. And it's just been this incredible font of understanding who we're in conversation with really early on. For us, and I actually started out on the board of the Laundromat Project for the first 5 official years of the organization, stepped away for a number of years and then came back as paid staff, the executive director. So I've seen many iterations, and I think these things change over the course of time. We're organisms. So the organization we were 5 years ago, 10, 15 years ago is different than who we are now. For the Laundromat Project, from day one, we have always been majority people of color on the board, specifically Black, but not only. And that has never shifted in any way. So we made that commitment from day one with the founder, Risa Wilson, who initially invited me on the board. We have open conversations about this. So one of the things that we actually realized a few years ago, because we work across BIPOC communities, but we had a majority Black board and maybe at the time 1 or 2 white members of our board. but not Asian or Latino. Or so we actually said to ourselves, this is something that's important and something that we're looking for, because we serve a multi-racial and multi-ethnic community. We wanted folks who were parents, because we do arts education that involves parents. We think about the economics, and of course we think about the economics, but we're really also interested in what people bring into the room. And for a lot of BIPOC organizations, the reality is money can't be our only driver, and hasn't been. We don't have access to the same people with the same kinds of pocketbooks. So we've always had to be a little more flex about that anyway. So we have people who, with varying levels of ability to give, but everyone is there because they want to be there, and they're willing to figure out ways to connect us to other kinds of resources. And they really believe in that mission. And for us, that's what's important. We are interested in having artists on our board, so we have artist alum. So we have a long list of different kinds of people. Sometimes it's demographics, sometimes it's skill-based and career-based, and sometimes it's people who live in a particular neighborhood. And we're constantly having that conversation openly as a board and a staff. And this experiment with doing something that was really open and transparent has been wonderful for us. And I highly recommend thinking about an open board call. And I'm happy to chat with anyone offline about that as well.
That would be great. Definitely curious about that. And, I do have a question for Nicola and Kibum. Have you had experience in assembling boards, whether they're advisory boards or boards of directors, and can speak to this as well?
Perhaps more informally, and the art community, even though it's global, is in essence still a community, and it's really about reaching out, outreach, having conversations that bring us together rather than separate us. So in the most informal sense, it's about finding people who have common goals and who feel they're looking for common outcomes. And in that way, it's actually quite easy, because if you're focused on the same target, it's easy to assemble and move towards that,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, I think practically speaking, the model is already there. When you see artist names on museum boards, they're not paying $100,000 a year like everybody else. Subsidize it, make it possible. People, Kemi and Nicola should be on boards of major American museums. Let's make it happen.
And that's a great mention, because I was going to save this for the end, but we actually have a conversation about museum boards. So I'm going to ask another viewer question. This one is from Sherlyn Gerard. And they say, what is your approach when presenting emerging artists of color from unrecognized markets to museum curatorial committees? So I think this is an excellent question of how do you create this platform for artists of color to be recognized in these markets?
Well, typically in past, it's easiest to go where curiosity is greatest. And there are a number of museum curators who just naturally have that curiosity, who tend towards that kind of energy very, very naturally, because they want to be at the edge of discovery. And that's typically where I would start those conversations. And then once a kind of critical mass is built, and you build it not only institutionally, but you build it among your collector groups, once you get that kind of synergy linked, then it begins a propulsion of its own. So yeah, I start with people who tend towards that curiosity easily, and who will be responsive to the work most readily.
Yeah, and I can speak to it from the sort of modus operandi of Commonwealth and Council. I think everyone has their own approach, and that's like the whole nature of being a dealer or any other kind of job. You have to find the sort of way of doing things that feels natural to you and effective for you. But we don't necessarily make like very specific pitches all the time to museum curators. Like we're all about like planting seeds. I call my sales strategy, the inception. You know, you have to make them think it was their idea. And so, and to look at the long game too. So it might not be the first show that you have with the artists where they get all of the attention either from institutions or collectors. It might take some time to build for people to see that work multiple times, to get more familiar with it, to begin to understand the process and the content in it. But I think that kind of approach also, you know, for us, helps you build trust with the museum curators, so they know that when we have these conversations and when we do take that kind of rare opportunity to make a very direct appeal, then they know that we're very serious and we're thoughtful about why we're bringing to their attention. But yeah, I mean, I think that generally the openings are there now. You know, for better or worse, museums are all terrified and quaking in their, you know, Prada boots around these issues. And but I think there's a lot of work you can do to prepare for that. So again, for better or worse, it's nice to have kind of good text that explains the work. You know, do you have a well-organized like portfolio? Do you have good like either press clippings or reviews or you know, essays about the artist's work? And it needs to be available in English. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of like work that you can do ahead of time in order to facilitate the process when the opportunity arises.
Absolutely. And this actually brings me to my last question, because I really do want to get, there's so many good questions coming in. But I want to ask what's next. We discussed earlier today that so many people, and in this industry has often benefited from inequity, sometimes unwittingly, whether they realize that or not. But what can investors, collectors, business leaders do to ensure that they're not supporting racial injustice, even if unknowingly? And what insight do you have, or what tips do you have that these industry execs are taking real steps to make the industry more equitable for artists of color? And I pose this to the group, so if anybody wants to jump in first, you know, I'd really just love some tips on this for those listening at the executive level.
I think one of
I'll start. Sorry. Yeah, yeah. To start briefly, I think I just want to say one thing. Is you know, we've been talking a lot about it, and many people have been throwing around the term and speaking to how they recognize their own privilege and white privilege and whatnot. But I think the next step in acknowledging privilege is to think about what you're going to give up. There's no way around it. You know, if you have privilege and if you have more than what is your fair share, that means that there are others who are getting less. And part of that, I think, is engaging in conversations that feel uncomfortable, you know, and that could be with your friends, but also to reach out to and hear the thoughts, read about, you know, different folks who are not in your usual milieu. If you feel perfectly comfortable in your position and in the way you're doing things and what you have surrounding you, that's not enough.
Excellent, excellent.
absolutely what.
Sorry, Kemi, please.
Sorry, the tech delays. So very much agree. One of the things when we think about issues of power is what we're willing to give up, and how we're willing to be different in the world is such an important thing. And some of that is very much self-reckoning, right? And I'm speaking both as a person, but also again, as someone who runs an organization and has to think about this from an organizational space, as do so many people on this call, I expect. So one of the things that I think is so central is to treat your people right. If you are treating your people right, and your people are your artists, your people are your staff, and not just the executive staff, other things come into play. Again, we saw the ways that institutions' values were laid bare in a moment of crisis, because crisis is when you really reveal who you are. It's easy to be the good guy when there's not a crisis. It's a lot harder when COVID, Black Lives Matter, racial injustice, and all kinds of things are kind of raining down on us collectively. And I think people did show themselves, and not everybody is happy with what was shown. And the summer just brought us deeper into what that conversation is. And I would say so many people of color in staff, and we know many arts administrators are also artists, and artists also engage in these conversations, wrote out everything we needed to know. Like if someone just goes through all those letters and just makes a grid, and I really hope somebody is doing this, we have all the information we need. We don't have to do every single thing, but we do have the information. The coming from the people who are most affected and who are doing this work on a daily basis, and they're making the work that we say we are here to support, and why we exist, why we are paid. I'm paid to do this work. Of course, I love it, but this is a job. It is labor, and labor deserves to be recognized in the context that we currently have. Labor should be recognized economically, among other ways. And budgets are moral documents. How we spend our money on professional development, on salaries, on benefits, on actually giving people jobs, not necessarily contract work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It all exists. I refuse to let us get off the hook by saying we don't know what we're supposed to do, because we.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm just going to tie a bow on what Kibum and Kemi are saying, which, brings to mind for me some artists thinking around this. And I think of Theastra Gates, Radical Hospitality, Colleen Smith, Radical Joy. And I think at this point, we need to start thinking about radical imaginings, radical generosity, not only of spirit, but of resources, how the power is distributed, all of it. And we think of our artists, who are the great creators. They're the magicians. We are the engineers, and we can help them bring these ideas into more logical places. Many of them, in the wake of all this disturb, bringing their communities into enrichment and developing new ways of working and merchandise, and calling people to come back into the art space for viewership. And so there's so many ways people can contribute. You don't have to, of course, the highest levels, it's uncomfortable and it will require a kind of generosity. But for everyone, you can get back into the art space, participate, be part of this new paradigm in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely. Nicola, Kemi, Kibum, thank you so much. This is excellent. I want to pivot to our questions, though, because we do have so many questions, and I'm not sure I'll be able to get to all of them, but there's some really interesting call outs. And Nicola, actually, there's a question specifically for you that I want to kick off with from Jörg Schnurra, who says, what do you think of the future of the art industry when it comes to digitization? And what does Kasim Dean think about the future of the art industry?
Well, of course, digitization, as we know, is front and center to so many conversations, because we are in a position now where we have to think both hyper locally in terms of person to person, who is in our immediate sphere of response, give and take, and then what the bridge that we need to build to our global audience, which had been so robust and profound coming into COVID. And I think the digital future is the answer. So there again, radical imaginings. How do we build a digital landscape that still feels real, while we know that connecting with art and analog is the absolute truth, right? So yeah, it will encompass a much larger part of our landscapes than we had ever imagined, but we have to get with it and develop it well and communicate with our audience as well. And of course, Kasim has been on this tip for ages. He's been thinking about the digital landscape for a very, very, very long time, and will continue to innovate in that space. So yes, we can't deny it. We have to push its bounds and see what good we can make of it for everyone.
Absolutely. And this next question I think it would be great for all three of you to respond, because it is, as three leaders in your organizations. This question is from Mara Gladstone, and they say, if an organization is struggling financially, but knows it has idea work to do, and knows what that work is, but cannot afford to do it, at least not now, what are the ethics of continuing on, knowing the organization cannot compensate people in the ways we should?
I would say one thing is to find out if there are people in your network who can actually be helpful, and for whom it wouldn't be a burden for them to help to participate in this now. And that is not to say if you do have people of color on your staff or disabled folks on your staff, et cetera, that they are that person. So let me just be clear about that, because many people have to do their job plus that job in an organization, and it's not always what we want to be doing. But there might be folks that your board members can connect you to other folks. And again, I'm a big believer in, you say things out loud, it's much more likely that you might find the thing you need than if you keep it to yourself, right? So you have actually shared this and shared your name. So I hope people are noting that. And if you feel helpful to move this organization forward, while you then commit to finding the resources that you need to do that work. And because this is a time when people are thinking about, connected to, there might be someone who's, and I don't know if you're for-profit, nonprofit, et cetera, so I'm speaking from a nonprofit space, but there might be folks, funders or others, who are actually open and ready to help you move along this journey. So don't make those assumptions, but if people don't know what you need, or that this is something you're struggling with but feel committed to doing, it is critical to do the work. It is one that is, it's not optional, it is critical. So then you have to get crafty and wily, like we are in every other part of the work that we do. We do not accept truth as it is given to us. That's why we're in the arts.
Just to follow up on that, I think the DIY spirit is something that is integral to how the art world has developed from time immemorial. So, and I actually think that limitations can be very fertile ground for experimentation. You know, as Nicola just talked about, like, you know, like a lot of opportunities on the digital space are less resource dependent. And, you know, I take a lot of heart. So you know, we mentioned that we're celebrating our 10 years. There's a lot of other spaces like 47 Canal in New York, which started as a party at like a free space. Bureau is celebrating 10 years, Night Gallery is celebrating 10 years. These were all these like intrepid spaces that sprung up during the last financial crisis. You know, these are moments, and I think what we'll see from 2020 onwards will be the same thing. Is like, these are moments for opportunity to rethink, to be radical, as Nicola says. You know, let's be radical, and have fun with it. So yeah, I mean, you know, and if there's a billionaire involved, like, get that money. But if it's among your friends, is like, it's also not, it doesn't always have to be transactional. So if you have the same kind of vision and mission and beliefs and values, then work together. You know.
Just thinking on that, the collective thing is so important. There were some trainings that I wanted to do around that, and we actually thought, this is a few years ago now, but we actually with 6 or 7 other organizations, all the executive directors knew one another, and instead of something that would have cost $30,000 for any one of us, somehow, I can't remember the math, but somehow we each ended up paying $1,000. Which was something that we could figure out how to get, whereas we couldn't do it as just one of us at a time. So definitely think about how to work collectively. Power is built collectively, and that this.
So we unfortunately are running out of time, so we can't get to the other questions. But I think that we had so many questions. It really is a testament to how much insight the three of you gave today. I would encourage those who may not have had a chance to ask questions to reach out, especially at Observer, and we might be able to pass those on. So I want to thank you, Kemi, Kibum, Nicola, for joining us. And for those out there, if you want to stay informed about future offerings, you can visit our website, businessofart.observer.com, for more information and a link to register for our newsletter. You can also join us for our next webinar next week on October 27th, where we will be looking forward to the health of the art industry in 2021 and what is needed from leaders to support artists, institutions, and galleries struggling in the face of this momentous year. Thank you. Thank you. The three of you have been so insightful, and I can't wait to see you with Observer in the future.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.